In the first years after World War II, as Europe tried to rebuild itself from ruins and grief, a very different kind of war began, one without bombing raids, tanks, or clear battle lines. It was a war fought in shadows, inside embassies, intelligence headquarters, and churches that echoed with the weight of centuries. And at the center of those shadows stood an institution older than any Western government still standing: the Vatican, a sovereign city-state barely 100 acres in size, yet commanding influence over hundreds of millions. To the outside world, the Vatican appeared to be entering a period of spiritual reflection after the devastation of global conflict. But inside its marble corridors, beneath frescoed ceilings and behind heavy oak doors, a quiet mobilization was underway. Reports from priests across Eastern Europe trickled in: churches seized, bishops imprisoned, religious orders dissolved, and believers forced into surveillance or silence. Across the Iron Curtain, Soviet rule viewed religion as a rival ideology, a threat to its absolute authority. And the Vatican understood this not as a local political dispute, but as a civilizational shift, one that could erase centuries of Christian tradition almost overnight. In Rome, the realization settled heavily upon the papal advisors. The Vatican might not command armies or nuclear arsenals, but it did command networks ancient, loyal, and dispersed across continents. Bishops, diplomats, missionaries, and scholars formed an information web stretching from Warsaw to Buenos Aires. And during the early Cold War, this web became something more: a strategic tool, a way to see beyond the barriers erected by the Soviet Union and its satellite regimes, a way to influence, pressure, negotiate, and sometimes even undermine. The Vatican's challenge was unprecedented. The Soviet Union, now a superpower, had carved out half of Europe, imposing a model of governance that rejected every tenet of religious life. Churches were watched, infiltrated, and sometimes burned. Priests were arrested in the middle of the night. Seminaries were replaced by state indoctrination centers. And in places like Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, and Lithuania, underground religious communities operated in constant fear, holding services in barns, forests, and basements. They smuggled news, letters, and appeals for help through whatever narrow channels remained open. The Vatican absorbed these reports with increasing alarm, realizing that millions were being spiritually and culturally severed from their heritage. Informal dossiers grew within the Secretariat of State, each document describing a new crackdown: a bishop exiled to Siberia, a monastery confiscated, a youth group outlawed. The Church's deep concern was matched by another realization. The Cold War was not only a geopolitical contest, it was an ideological war for the soul of Europe. During these years, Rome began to function like an alternative diplomatic intelligence center. Priests traveling into Eastern Europe to perform pastoral missions returned with coded notes hidden in religious texts. Nuns carried microfilm sewn into rosary pouches. Bishops visiting from Poland brought reports detailing which local officials were sympathetic and which had been fully absorbed into the Soviet apparatus. The Vatican, though neutral in public, was quietly assembling one of the most detailed human intelligence pictures of life behind the Iron Curtain. Yet raw information was only one part of the mission. The Vatican was also crafting a long game, a strategy to preserve faith in territories where public worship could lead to arrest. The papacy saw itself not as a political actor, but as a guardian of identity, tradition, and dignity. The Holy See knew that the Cold War would not be won quickly or militarily. It would be won through endurance, through moral authority, through the survival of community, teaching, ritual, and memory. But endurance required action, and action required allies. Throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, high-level Vatican emissaries traveled quietly to Washington, London, Bonn, and Paris. Meetings were held not in official embassies, but in private residences, monasteries, and diplomatic safe rooms. Western governments sought intelligence. The Vatican sought protection for persecuted believers. In these exchanges, an unspoken alliance formed, one where the Holy See provided insight into life behind the Iron Curtain, and Western states offered resources, political pressure, and at times, covert support. The Vatican's role grew even more complex as nationalism, communism, and anti-religious policy intersected. The Church was forced to negotiate with regimes it fundamentally opposed. It authorized discreet contacts with Eastern Bloc officials, not out of trust but necessity. Letters from imprisoned clergy were smuggled to Rome. Messages from the Vatican were smuggled back in. It became a silent negotiation between a spiritual empire and an ideological one, each trying to influence the other without ever appearing to do so openly. As the 1950s progressed, one truth became undeniable. The Vatican had become one of the Cold War's most unconventional players. It had no soldiers, but its moral influence reached millions. It had no spies in the traditional sense, but its global clergy brought information even intelligence agencies struggled to obtain. It had no economic leverage, but its spiritual authority could shift public sentiment, especially in Catholic-heavy nations bordering the Soviet sphere. And the Vatican knew it was being watched. The KGB monitored priests, intercepted church communications, pressured local bishops, and tried to turn clergy into informants. Religious documents were seized. Homilies were recorded and analyzed for political content. Even inside Vatican City, Soviet operatives attempted to infiltrate through embassies, academic conferences, and church-organized humanitarian programs. Some succeeded. The Vatican archives still contain classified files describing suspected moles and compromised networks. Despite the pressure, the Vatican refined its strategy. It invested in underground seminaries, printing presses, and smuggling routes that brought banned religious texts into Eastern Europe. It supported exiled communities and foreign-language radio broadcasts that reached listeners behind the Iron Curtain. And as the Cold War deepened, the Vatican quietly shifted from simply resisting Soviet repression to shaping long-term diplomatic outcomes. By the early 1960s, Vatican diplomats had developed a doctrine known internally as a policy of contact without concession, a way to engage Soviet governments just enough to negotiate space for believers, but never enough to legitimize the repression they inflicted. It was a dangerous balancing act, one that required patience, subtlety, and the ability to influence global politics without ever appearing political. This was the Vatican's clandestine mission during the Cold War, a spiritual state acting as a silent counterforce to a superpower, using faith, diplomacy, and underground networks instead of weapons, not to win territory, but to preserve a civilization threatened by erasure. And as the 1960s arrived, the Vatican began preparing for a shift so dramatic it would alter not only Catholic history but global geopolitics. The emergence of a new papal vision that would confront the Soviet Union in ways no government dared to attempt. As the 1960s unfolded, the Vatican stood on the edge of transformation. The old diplomatic strategies, quiet warnings, coded letters, discreet meetings in neutral capitals were no longer enough. The Cold War was accelerating. Soviet influence had expanded into Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Nuclear weapons now defined global balance. And inside the Eastern Bloc, a generation born under communist rule was coming of age, many of whom had never experienced public religious life. The Vatican sensed both danger and opportunity. Its leaders understood that the Cold War could no longer be treated as a temporary crisis. It had become an era, a structure, a defining condition of world affairs. And if the Church was to survive within this new reality, it would need to reshape itself, its message, its diplomacy, and its global presence. This realization converged with a profound internal development, the calling of the Second Vatican Council. What the world saw as a grand ecclesiastical reform was also, in many ways, a geopolitical recalibration. Bishops from every continent gathered in Rome, bringing with them stories of persecution, resistance, and underground faith communities. The Vatican listened closely, gathering insights from those living under communist rule. Reports from Poland described catechism taught secretly in apartments. Letters from Ukraine detailed clandestine liturgies held in forests. Testimonies from Czechoslovakia recounted how state-controlled peace priests attempted to replace authentic clergy. Each example revealed a Soviet strategy not merely to suppress religion, but to replace it. Vatican planners concluded that the Church's survival behind the Iron Curtain required more than endurance. It required adaptability. Structures had to become flexible. Leadership had to be decentralized. And the Vatican had to assume a new role, not only the center of global Catholicism, but a protector of cultural identity under ideological attack. This new approach brought the Vatican into deeper, though still concealed, interaction with Western powers. Intelligence agencies began analyzing Vatican communications for early warnings of internal unrest in the Eastern Bloc. The Church, in return, used Western pressure to negotiate concessions for persecuted communities. In Italy, West Germany, and Austria, diplomatic cables revealed a growing recognition among governments. The Vatican possessed insights that no spy network could replicate. Yet the Holy See remained careful. It refused to be perceived as an arm of any government. The Vatican's moral authority depended on independence. It navigated the Cold War like a ship moving between two storms, one ideological, one geopolitical, avoiding alignment while simultaneously shaping events on both sides. The strategy became even more urgent as Soviet repression intensified. In places like Hungary, the Church was forced into a divided existence, an official hierarchy tolerated by the state, and an underground hierarchy functioning as the true spiritual leadership. In Romania and Bulgaria, the situation was even more severe. State churches attempted to erase Catholic presence entirely. Priests who refused collaboration were exiled, forced into labor camps, or declared non-persons. Families who attended secret masses risked losing their jobs or their children. Despite this, the underground church endured, often strengthened rather than weakened by persecution. And as the Vatican analyzed reports from these regions, it recognized a remarkable pattern. Faith had become a form of resistance. In a world where the state controlled schools, media, professions, and travel, religious gatherings, public or clandestine, were among the last remaining expressions of local identity and community. This realization reshaped Vatican Cold War policy. The Church no longer viewed itself merely as a caretaker of religious doctrine, but as a guardian of human dignity in territories where the state claimed total control over the individual. To sustain this mission, the Vatican expanded its covert communication channels. A network of couriers, priests, scholars, humanitarian workers traveled on carefully planned routes. Some carried microfilmed reports hidden inside candle wax or sewn beneath cassock hems. Others smuggled religious icons and texts disguised as cultural artifacts. The system grew sophisticated enough that even intelligence agencies were impressed by its precision. The KGB, however, understood the significance of this network and intensified its countermeasures. Priests were monitored from the moment they crossed a border. Informants were embedded within religious communities. Churches were wired with listening devices. Religious literature was intercepted and destroyed. When the regime discovered an underground seminary in Lithuania, authorities confiscated every Bible they found. But the Vatican's network adapted, finding new routes, new methods, new layers of secrecy. By the late 1970s, the Vatican had established a complex dual strategy: covert support for the underground church and carefully orchestrated diplomatic engagement with communist governments. Public statements remained cautious, emphasizing peace and dialogue. But private memoranda preserved today in Vatican archives reveal a different tone, one of urgency, frustration, and determination. The Vatican understood that direct confrontation with the Soviet Union was impossible. But influence could be exerted indirectly, through culture, through spirituality, through the quiet survival of communities the state sought to erase. And influence, once seeded, could spread far beyond church walls. Behind the scenes, the Holy See monitored subtle shifts within the Eastern Bloc, workers beginning to organize in Poland, intellectuals questioning censorship in Czechoslovakia, families risking punishment to baptize their children, young people listening to foreign radio broadcasts that carried messages of hope, some of which originated from Vatican-supported programs. At the same time, a new wave of Vatican diplomats emerged, figures educated in theology but trained in geopolitics, economics, and international relations. Their mission was to navigate the fragile space between compromise and resistance. Their work was conducted in embassy-backed rooms, behind monastery walls, in train compartments, and across hotel lobbies where every word might be overheard. They negotiated for the release of imprisoned bishops, arranged humanitarian aid that doubled as communication channels, and assessed the psychological pulse of nations under authoritarian rule. This was the Vatican's quiet campaign, a sustained, strategic, and deeply human effort to protect souls in a century defined by ideological conflict. But everything changed in 1978. The election of a new pope from the Eastern Bloc, an event unprecedented in modern history, shifted the Cold War's entire balance. The world saw a religious selection, the Soviet Union saw a geopolitical earthquake, and the Vatican understood, with clarity sharper than ever before, that the next phase of the Cold War would not be fought in embassies or archives. It would be fought in the hearts and minds of millions who had lived under Soviet rule their entire lives. This was the beginning of a new era, one where the Vatican would become one of the most unexpected forces shaping the Cold War's final decades. The elevation of a pope from the Eastern Bloc reshaped the geopolitical landscape with a force that intelligence agencies had not anticipated. The Vatican, once perceived as a symbolic moral authority, suddenly became an active strategic player. His election carried more than religious significance. It represented the emergence of a leader who understood the psychological architecture of life under Soviet rule. He knew the mechanisms of censorship, the patterns of surveillance, the political pressure applied to clergy, the disintegration of families, and the ways entire generations were trained to distrust anything outside the state. For the first time, the Vatican was led by someone who had lived the Cold War not from a diplomatic desk, but from inside its machinery. Within months, the effects became visible. Pilgrimages grew, religious gatherings multiplied, underground networks expanded with newfound confidence. Faith, once suppressed to private spaces, began re-entering public life across the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet leadership recognized the threat immediately. A population that regained spiritual identity risked becoming a population capable of questioning power, demanding change, and refusing ideological conformity. The state's monopoly on meaning, its attempt to define reality, truth, and loyalty, was cracking. Intelligence archives later revealed how closely the Kremlin monitored every Vatican move. Reports were drafted describing the Pope's travel plans, the content of his public statements, and the mass mobilization that followed each appearance. Analysts noted that his presence created psychological shifts in regions where the state had invested decades into erasing religious life. Every gathering, every homily, every pilgrimage weakened the ideological cohesion the Soviet system depended on. To the Kremlin, the Vatican had become a cultural insurgency. Meanwhile, the Vatican intensified its quiet operations. It expanded its communication routes into Eastern Europe, strengthened contact with underground clergy, and broadened its influence within exiled communities across the West. A vast external network formed: academics, diplomats, humanitarian workers, broadcasters, theologians, each contributing to a slow but persistent erosion of Soviet ideological control. Radio programs tailored for Eastern Bloc audiences carried messages of dignity and resilience, designed to bypass state propaganda. Humanitarian channels disguised as aid shipments carried religious materials, microfilm documents, and instructions for underground communities. Exiled intellectuals were supported to publish works forbidden in their homelands. The Soviet Union attempted to counter these efforts with censorship, jamming, and surveillance, but information seeped through, destabilizing the carefully constructed worldview imposed by the state. In Poland, the Vatican's influence converged with a historic moment. The emergence of a labor movement in the shipyards created a pressure point the regime failed to predict. The Vatican monitored events closely, recognizing the movement's potential to reshape not only Poland, but the trajectory of the entire Eastern Bloc. It provided moral reinforcement without offering a political blueprint, allowing the movement to grow organically while avoiding direct confrontation. For ordinary citizens, the knowledge that the Vatican supported their dignity created psychological space for resistance. For the state, this meant a population no longer fully under its control. As unrest grew, the Vatican intensified its diplomatic maneuvers. It maintained public calls for peace while privately working to prevent violent crackdowns. It navigated between encouraging nonviolent resistance and avoiding escalation that could result in bloodshed. The Holy See's diplomatic corps operated with precision, applying pressure through Western governments, human rights organizations, and international institutions. Each message was crafted to protect lives while sustaining momentum for change. The combination of moral authority and geopolitical strategy proved more effective than many governments expected. These developments alarmed the Soviet hierarchy. Internal documents described the Vatican as a destabilizing force capable of influencing millions without deploying weapons or troops. This form of soft power, grounded in culture and belief, proved far more difficult to counter than military pressure. Soviet attempts to discredit the Vatican consistently failed. Propaganda lacked credibility among citizens who had endured decades of repression. Surveillance expanded, but underground communities adapted. Informants provided partial insights, but the movement's true strength came from intangible forces, tradition, identity, and a sense of moral awakening. By the early 1980s, the Vatican's role in the Cold War had expanded beyond religious affairs. It became a central participant in global ideological competition. Western governments increasingly sought the Vatican's insights into the political psychology of Eastern Europe. Intelligence agencies monitored its statements with interest, recognizing the Church as a barometer of emerging unrest. Diplomats acknowledged that the Vatican had access to networks and information channels unavailable to any government. Its position, supranational, moral, culturally embedded, allowed it to operate where formal diplomacy could not. While publicly advocating peace, the Vatican privately assessed vulnerabilities within the Soviet system. It recognized that the USSR's control was eroding not from external pressure but from internal contradictions. Economic stagnation, public dissatisfaction, ideological fatigue. Its strategy shifted accordingly. Rather than direct confrontation, it supported movements that emphasized human rights, national identity, and cultural continuity. These concepts undermined the Soviet ideological claim that individuals belonged solely to the state. By promoting dignity and conscience, the Vatican helped weaken the foundations of authoritarian governance. Throughout these years, the Holy See remained cautious. It understood that its influence, though profound, could provoke dangerous retaliation. Efforts were made to avoid triggering repression that might cost lives. Yet even with careful navigation, threats intensified. There were attempts to fracture the Church from within through propaganda campaigns, fabricated scandals, and infiltration efforts. Priests were pressured to collaborate. Religious institutions were monitored. Yet the Vatican's internal cohesion and strategic discipline allowed it to withstand these pressures. As the decade progressed, the cracks within the Eastern Bloc widened. Economic failures deepened. Intellectual resistance grew. Underground religious communities expanded. And national identities, long suppressed, re-emerged with unexpected strength. The Vatican continued its subtle campaign, reinforcing hope, articulating human dignity, and sustaining cultural memory. It offered neither revolutionary slogans nor political programs. Instead, it offered an alternative vision of the human person, one distinct from the state ideology, and one that millions found increasingly compelling. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet leadership faced a population gradually slipping from its ideological grasp. The Vatican, once treated as a marginal actor, had become a central force in shaping global perceptions of the Cold War. Its influence was not loud, not militaristic, and not overt. It operated in the intangible realm of belief, meaning, and moral authority, precisely where the Soviet system was weakest. The transformation underway was not yet complete, but the direction was unmistakable. The power of ideas, carried through sermons, broadcasts, pilgrimages, and cultural resilience, had begun to unravel one of the most formidable political systems in modern history. And at the center of this shift stood the Vatican, orchestrating a form of resistance that required no armies and no violence, only persistence, memory, and faith capable of surviving decades of repression. The final document in the sealed Vatican packet was unlike the others. No red stamps, no diplomatic signatures, just a thin piece of paper bearing a single handwritten sentence in Latin. Veritas non timet tenebras. The truth does not fear the darkness. Below it a date, 1989, the year the Berlin Wall fell. As the archivist held the paper under the dim Vatican bulb, a faint watermark slowly appeared. An outline of the papal keys crossed over a globe. Hidden in the curves of the design was a cipher that matched none of the Cold War codes mentioned earlier. It wasn't a diplomatic message. It wasn't espionage. It wasn't a warning. It was a confession. A short annotation, barely visible, revealed the Vatican's final, unspoken move during the collapse of the USSR. A covert channel established not with Western intelligence, but secretly with reformist figures inside the Soviet Orthodox clergy. Conversations held in abandoned monasteries, unnamed bishops who risked exile, a silent alliance bridging two ancient branches of Christianity. No signatures, no proof. Just a final line, written by a hand believed to be Pope John Paul II himself. Let the world believe it fell by history. We will know it fell by faith. The archivist closed the last file. The Cold War story was complete, not with weapons or spies, but with shadows, whispers, and a final move hidden behind centuries-old marble. And like all Vatican secrets, this one would return to silence. Locked once again in the depths of the apostolic archives, waiting for another hand bold enough to open the door.